It's amazing what you can observe from a small town reading small town papers. I think propaganda is a lot less covert. People just print what they're told. They're not as crafty about trying to sugarcoat it or make it obscure it. They just blurt it out. I think of the example of Kevin Close. Kevin Close was head of NPR from 1998 to 2008. And right in the run-up to the Iraq War, many months before that war was even considered a possibility. If you recall, the war started March 20th, 2003. In the fall of the previous year, 2002, Kevin Close, president of NPR, came back to his little hometown, which is near mine, and gave a talk. You know, local boy makes good. What did Kevin Close talk about in the fall of 2002, long before any American accepted the idea, well, any except wacko Americans accepted the idea of invading Iraq? The head of NPR, in a meeting, in a talk to local people in Dutchess County, New York, talked about why we needed to invade Iraq. A full 7 months before the invasion, when most Americans were by no means accepting of the idea. And he was head of National Public Radio. Before that, by the way, he was head of the U.S. Information Agency, the Broadcasting Bureau of the U.S. Information Agency, which is a straight-up propaganda arm of the government. Nothing wrong with that. Governments are entitled to use propaganda, especially when they issue it from the U.S. Information Agency. But to have somebody president of National Public Radio doing a back-home speaking tour, trying to persuade people that invading Iraq was a great idea 7 months before the invasion, that's pretty sketchy. Got another sketchy thing. I was reading a headline in this tiny little paper that we've got here, pretty primitive, pretty simple, and the headline said, "Young people plead for peace during walkout demonstrations." I thought, wow, that's great. I didn't realize kids were so concerned about what was going on in the Middle East. I mean, after all, we're in Iraq, we're in Afghanistan, we're in Syria. We've destabilized all kinds of countries in the meantime, wreaking havoc everywhere. Hundreds of thousands of people killed, hundreds of thousands of people permanently injured, millions of people displaced, starving. And our young people, my God, God bless them, they're up there pleading for peace. And this article ran on the 15th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. I thought, wow, that's pretty good. Then I realized these weren't anti-war demonstrations, these were anti-gun demonstrations. Young people plead for peace during walkout demonstrations. Now, I don't know where you stand on the gun debate. I will say this. Just look at history. Every time a dictator takes power, the first thing they do, and I mean the first day, if not the first hour, they give an order for all guns in private hands to be collected, usually on penalty of death. Pretty interesting. That's the historical record. And you may say, well, America's different, and we want to do it because we're sensible and we want safety. Well, one way to promote safety is when somebody threatens dozens of times to kill people in a school, that maybe you take hold of that person and figure out what the heck is going on with him. If you made a comment like that even once in public, I guarantee the police would be at your door. But this guy, we're talking about the Florida shooter who precipitated all this, he was allowed to run free, run wild, no problem. So, and this is the case with all of these guys. They're all known to the police before. There are some cases where either they or family members are FBI informants, like in the Boston bombing or in that shooting in Orlando at that nightclub. It turns out the dad was an FBI informant. It's just a little too bizarre that so many of these shootings end up with some kind of previous connection to the FBI. It's just really strange. We won't go into that too deeply, but it needs to be said. But what's also very strange is this. I study and look at how students and children are treated in school. Public schools, in particular, are very repressive institutions. You're not encouraged to speak your mind. You're not encouraged to criticize. You're not encouraged to point out flaws. You're even not encouraged to speak up about abuse when you're being abused by a teacher. If a child makes a mistake and accidentally brings his penknife to school, he might go to the police station in handcuffs that day. He might be banned from school. He might be thrown out of school permanently. So the level of repression in public schools is very high. And yet now it's okay for kids to shut their schools down nationwide in this coordinated effort to promote what? Promote violating the Second Amendment? But they're being cheered, they're being applauded, they're being encouraged. I have to ask, who's organizing this? Because, God bless young people of the current time and of all time. I mean, they bring energy and vitality and initiative and a lot, excitement, just a lot of positive things. But the idea of this spontaneous nationwide movement that appears in hundreds of schools all over the country all at once, I'm not buying it. There's nothing spontaneous about it. It's being directed. And the other half of that equation is it's being tolerated. For instance, in this case, this is not a small town, but it's not a city. Wappingers Junior High. It's a suburban sprawl kind of town, an exurban town, not suburban, but beyond the suburbs. 700 students decided to walk out? Really? That's not something that's tolerated. But in this case, it is tolerated. In this case, it's encouraged. In this case, it's rewarded. In this case, it's lauded. So let's take this around now, 15th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq, when you would think that a normal country, a country that's thinking, a country that's feeling, would be asking, why are we still in Iraq? Why are we still in Afghanistan? Why are we destabilizing Syria? Why did we destabilize Libya? Why are we creating havoc all over the world? And here we're coming up on the 15th anniversary of this horrendous war that everybody knows now, everybody accepts was started based on lies and fraud. And yet the war goes on. And so what's the headline? It's not about the 15th anniversary of Iraq. It's not about people protesting that. It's not about school children asking, what kind of a country do we have where we're involved in the destruction of hundreds and thousands and millions of lives, really. Hundreds of thousands dead, hundreds of thousands wounded, millions homeless, millions without electricity and proper food and proper water, all as a result of these wars. These were not rich countries, but people lived. They could take care of their families. They had homes. They ate. They could go to the doctor. That's all gone for millions and millions of people in Syria alone. It's over 10 million people are in refugee camps. That's one country. So are young people being told that that's the problem and that that's not the proper conduct for the United States? And we should get out of those places and we should, to the extent we can, make amends without causing a further disaster over there? No. They're being told to join the crusade against guns. And I don't deny that bad things have happened in schools and other public places. But there are sick people out there, and when sick people are allowed to run free, which is what they've been allowed to do in all these shooting cases, bad things will happen. And maybe instead of protesting some sort of general discomfort with private citizens owning firearms, maybe people should be protesting the incompetence, perhaps the deliberate incompetence of local law enforcement. But they certainly should be looking at trillions of dollars being squandered, their own standard of living being diminished, their own futures being amputated by an endless series of illegal, immoral wars around the world. But that's not what the students are protesting. They're protesting whatever it is they're protesting. I think it's possible that people in the psychological operations departments saw this anniversary coming up, and they wanted a headline and they wanted action, but they didn't want people marching in the streets against Iraq. They didn't want young people questioning Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. They wanted them otherwise engaged in a different agenda, which is what they certainly are engaged in. So you may call me a conspiracy theorist, but there are people that make a living directing psychological operations. And if I was directing a psychological operation and a hugely important anniversary was coming up, I would do everything I could to fill the headlines with something completely different. And this one is just so blatant. Young people plead for peace during walkout demonstrations. They're not demonstrating against the Pentagon. They're not demonstrating against the military, industrial, congressional complex. They're not demonstrating against illegal and immoral wars. They are, I think, being used as pawns and puppets in another psychological operation. I just can't see this happening spontaneously, and I can't see school administrators who otherwise are control freaks and love to clamp down on any kind of free speech on junior high school and high school campuses. I can't see them going along with this unless they've essentially been told go along with it. So that's Brasscheck analysis. You can believe it or not believe it, or question it or not question it. I think it's something worth thinking about.